Well, thank you, Pastor Mika. So my name is Sergio Chavez. I'm on the pastor team here at 24/7. Welcome. And as Pastor Mika said, we kicked off a sermon series last week called Style and Story, inspired by the stories behind clothing. And so thank you, Pastor Mika, for kicking off with children's clothing last week. And we talked about that and then stories of Samuel. And today I get to talk about punk style, which I was pretty excited about because I'm very much a rocker. Now, I was never really a punk rocker, but I do like punk music for sure, and I like old school punk music, like traditional, I guess you would call it traditional punk music. I'm somewhat of a purist, but not a complete purist when it comes to music. But punk style was very interesting to me. And so when we look at the punk style, we got to look at where it comes from, and that's punk music. And punk music was a rebellion or a counterculture to the glam rock of the 60s and the 70s. You know, bands like Boston and REO Speedwagon and Kiss and these type of bands. Good bands, but it was very overproduced and really big and it was really, well, glam. That's why I call it glam rock. And punk rock was a rebellion against it. It was counterculture to that. And it was it became a DIY movement, like do-it-yourself movement, where you didn't really need to know how to play instruments all that well in order to play it. They played it fast, they played it loud, and they made the songs very simple. And in fact, it's so much like exemplified on how much of a musician you didn't need to be in the iconic musician Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols, who never really actually learned how to play the bass while he was alive. There's a story of when they were in the studio to record one of their albums, and he was hospitalized. This guy was crazy, so he was hospitalized, and the band was somewhat relieved that he wasn't there because he didn't really know how to play the bass. So the guitarist played the bass on that album. Of course, he played live. So it just goes to show of what the punk movement had is this kind of do-it-yourself. It was passionate, and you had to be super committed to do it because you weren't going to be liked by the masses for the most part. But punk music was fast, it was simple, and most of all, it was counter-culture to mainstream rock and roll. Now, punk style, the fashion behind it, didn't really start off with the actual punk movement because the punk movement started out here in United States from the Ramones and from these iconic punk band, Bad Brains. I'm a big fan of Bad Brains. But the early on punk rockers, they didn't have the iconic punk look that we think of with the big mohawks and the zippers and all that kind of stuff. They were kind of straightforward with leather jeans and t-shirts leather jeans. Leather jackets, t-shirts, and jeans. And they had a little bit of uniqueness, as you can see here. HR from Bad Brains, he's got this kind of military-style coat with a couple extra things on it. But there wasn't too over the top. It was pretty straightforward. An interesting fact, side note, historically people think of punk rock as a movement by disenfranchised Caucasian kids, a bunch of Caucasian kids. This is Bad Brains, one of the first punk bands. And actually we can go back and we can trace punk rock to a band called Death, which is 3 African-American cats from Detroit who heard, they went to a rock concert, I can't remember who they saw, and they decided instead of playing R&B and funk, they tried to play rock and roll. But their version of it was not like their rock and roll. And they really are the people who started punk, and we call it now proto-punk, meaning pre-punk. They didn't know they were playing punk rock. They were just trying to play rock music. They just were doing it wrong. And that started off the culture of punk rock. That was very interesting when I was researching punk rock, because I always knew Bad Brains, I knew these other cats, but I didn't realize they were on the forefront. But the main idea, again, is that punk is completely counter-culture. And that's what interests me the most. So I looked up counterculture. What is counterculture? Well, it's a way of life and set of attitudes opposed to or at variance, meaning different, with the prevailing social norm. Now, the reason why punk music and other types of music and these type of alternative things interest me is because I tend to be a little bit of a rebel myself, for those of you who know me. I'm pretty laid back when it comes to everyday life, but I tend to sway towards non-mainstream things, and I tend not to always fit in every situation. I do my best, but there's many things that I'm not really into. And so counterculture is something that has always interested me. Another reason why that is I think is because of just my situation. I'm an immigrant from Mexico who was raised here in Seattle. I came here when I was 2. And even within my own culture, yes, I'm Mexicano, and I grew up in a Latin home. But if I go back home to Mexico, I'm not really Mexicano. Once they hear me talk in Spanish, they're like, wait a minute, where were you born? I was like, no, I was born in Mexico. They're like, really? And I was like, yeah. But I went to America when I was 2. I was like, oh, no. Oh, well, you're just American. I'm like, my green card doesn't say I am, but if you think so. So I don't even really, I'm like in between. I'm not fully U.S. American. I'm not fully Mexican. I'm just something in between. So never quite fitting in. So the idea of counterculture has always interested me. And counterculture can live in many different avenues. It can be in food. You can be counterculture in music, in art, in dress, and even religion, which is something that interests me when I started listening to this podcast of punk style. So the idea of counterculture and religion, as I started thinking about that, I started thinking, well, what in the Bible shows that? And what I landed on was the book of Daniel. Now, as a kid, the book of Daniel was my favorite book. It still is so far my favorite book. Nothing has topped it. But I didn't realize all the counterculture in the book of Daniel. Nothing but rebels up in that joint, which is probably why I was attracted to it. So we're going to look at a story in the book of Daniel. And I just want to bring you up to speed to what part of the story that we're talking about. So for those of you who may not have read Daniel or may not know Daniel, it's basically the Israelites, God's chosen people. They've been going through this cycle of following God and then not following God, and God having to send prophet after prophet and leader after leader and king after king to kind of reset them. They kind of keep on falling off the beaten path. And then as well, God kind of warns them like, look, if you're not careful, you're going to lose all this, which ends up happening. They end up getting overthrown, Israel. They get exiled to Babylon, meaning they get taken from their land, and they put under the rule of Babylon, a foreign power with different governances, social norms, and religion. So now the Israelites, the Jews, are no longer in their own land. They're taken, they're in Babylon, and they now have to follow this new regime. And under Babylonian rule, they live counter-culture lives. Because they don't completely adopt all of Babylon's culture, because it would violate some of God's laws. So there's certain things that they can't be a part of. And the story in Daniel, they start off with a few cats who are picked for the court of the king, Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel and his 3 homies, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Whoa, yeah. That's their Jewish names. So they're picked to come work at the court. And right off the bat, they're saying, okay, you're going to be part of the court. You need to be, you need to partake in how we take care of those who are part of the king's entourage or the king's posse. So you eat this food, eat this wine, eat this stuff from the king. And Daniel stands up and rebels and says, I'm not going to have any of it. It's a small thing, but he stands up to the king. Now, he doesn't stand directly up to the king. He stands up to the person who's taking care of him and says, no, instead, let's have Vegemite sandwiches or vegetables and water. I don't know if they had Vegemite back then. I don't know what the Australians were doing back then. But he says, no, we'll be cool. And the guy who's taking care of him is worried. He's like, look, if you don't eat the food you're supposed to and you look all decrepit and weak, I'm going to get killed. And Daniel convinces him, no, just after 10 days, or I think it was 10 days, after 10 days, if we look like we're healthy and we're good, then let us continue. And sure enough, after 10 days, they looked stronger, they looked healthier than the other cats, and so they're rewarded for their rebellion. This is just the beginning. You can see the start of this movement, of this counterculture movement within Babylon in order for them to follow God. Right. And then, story after story, eventually we get to a major part of Daniel. And that is the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, comes up with this idea, and he makes this golden image, and he makes a huge deal that he wants everybody to worship it. He organizes getting people from all over the land to come to to Babylon in order to worship. And he says, when you hear the music, when you hear the sackbut and the lyre and the horn and whatever, then it's time for you to worship. I don't know what a sackbut is, but I want to learn how to play it. I feel in my mind, I know in my mind, it must be punk. It must have been the punk rockers of the time, sackbutters. I don't know. I feel like this is how you play a sackbut, but I may not be sure. But I've never seen one. Is that not right? Maybe one day I'll get a sackbut. Maybe we'll have a sackbut here. We won't worship a golden image, but we'll lead worship with a sackbut. Sackbut worship is a new trend that's happening in USA. So he says, roll the sackbut, the lyre, the horn, or whatever, and when you hear this music, everybody is to bow down and worship this golden image. And if you don't, throw you in a fire. Because you got to listen to the king. This is Babylon. You ain't in Israel anymore. That's right. They don't play around. So this decree is made, and this day is organized. Everybody is there. It's a huge event. Cue the sackbut. Everybody falls down to worship except some Jews. And that's when things get all kinds of crazy. Because they see that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't worship the golden image. Why? Because that would violate God's command. The first two commandments is 1, have no other gods before me. 2, make yourself no graven images and don't worship them. So they're not going to break the commandments. They are sticking to their morals and their laurels, and they are not going to violate that because they believe God is the ultimate authority, not the culture they're within. Clearly, this gets people bent out of shape. And we hear these cats come up to the king and says, you, O king, made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn and blah, 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 and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whoever does not fall shall be thrown in a fiery furnace. And then they go on and says, there are certain Jews, whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Now, the reason why it's such a big deal is because they were appointed to be part of his court. They're not just the commoner. They are in the entourage of the king. So they're in a position of authority. They're in a position of highly visibility, and they are rebelling. So it's a huge deal. Certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, now they're Babylonian names. These men, O king, and my favorite part, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Man, these cats are a bunch of rebellion, bunch of rebels, man. Can you imagine what the church would look like if we rebelled like this? What would be the things that the church would rebel? What would be the things that we stand up for against the culture that's asking us to bow down to? How would the church react? I mean, this is like, the position they're in is like somebody who's high up in government, or maybe maybe some conference leaders or somebody in some big place who says, sorry, I'm not going to do it. It's a big deal. And the reason why this is such an important part is because unlike Daniel's rebellion, that was behind closed doors. That was at the palace. So the only people who experienced that were those who were on the inside of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the king's people, and that rebellion wasn't highly seen. This, on the other hand, everybody sees it. Come on now. And so when we go back to punk style, so punk didn't really have a fashion to it, but eventually punk made its way to the UK. And when it made its way to the UK, it landed in a woman's hands called Vivienne Westwood in this boutique at King's Road, which I don't know where it's at, but it's in the UK, owned by this other cat, but she was the one who made all the clothes. She had no formal training, so she sewed all of her own stuff. And they always like pushing the boundaries. So they would use stuff from like the sex trade. They would use stuff from like wherever they could find it, put stuff on clothes. Everything that was sewn wasn't quite like right. It wasn't quite symmetrical. They did all these things. And she was the one who started designing these pieces that these punk rockers, these post-cultural people started wearing. Because punk at that time was all about the anti-establishment of the times. There was people who were losing their jobs. There wasn't enough work in places in the UK, and punk was giving them a voice for equality. And so they made themselves highly visible and wearing Vivienne Westwood stuff. And out of it, we get the iconic punk look that we all know, with the mohawks and the ripped t-shirts with the safety pins and the pants with 100 zippers on it and like whatever they're like straps from legs to leg. And Vivienne actually produced one of my favorite early punk rockers, and I don't know, you call him post-punk rocker, and that's Susie Sue from Sushi and the Banshees. And you can see what she's wearing, some of the stuff that Vivienne helped her with, obviously influenced her, of this ripped, some fishnet stuff and things that aren't quite the way they're supposed to be. She's got a tie with no collar. And you can see the amount of counterculture that this clothes expressed to what was happening at the time. If you've never heard Susie and the Banshees and you like music, I suggest you go listen to at least Peekaboo. At least go listen to that song. From there, you can do whichever you want. But Susie and the Banshees are amazing. But you can see that this punk rock music now had a face. It now became a thing. And the Sex Pistols, which is another iconic punk rock bands, well, actually, Vivienne Westwood and Biscuits, who owned the shop, helped them get the record deal. They helped get them noticed. And so that blew up even more. And so you can see now there was already a rebellion happening. There was already this counterculture happening, but Vivienne Westwood just gave it a look. And now the entire world saw it. And just like Daniel and his rebellion within the palace, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's rebellion within that huge event, now everyone saw this counterculture. And this movement that now had a face. And what ends up happening to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Does God reward them for the rebellion? Well, He does, but not until they get thrown into a fire. Because Biscuits, Nebuchadnezzar, he's a man of his word, throws them into the fire. They get thrown in. There's 3 of them in there, and all of a sudden within there, for those of you who might know the story, all of a sudden Nebuchadnezzar sees 4 people. There's another cat in there. There's another image called it looks like the Son of Man, I believe. And so it was through this rebellion, this sense of standing up against the culture, the sense of danger, actually having to go through the fire, that they ultimately experience Jesus. They ultimately experience God, and they come out of there unscathed. And from their act of rebellion, Nebuchadnezzar says, clearly your God is the true God. Now, side note, Nebuchadnezzar says that 3 times, I believe, because at that time, they believed in a lot of gods. So at that time, he was like, yeah, your God's the God. And then later on, he doesn't quite believe, and then he gets dreams interpreted, and then he believes again, oh, your God is the God. Because they believed many gods. So he didn't have the idea of a monotheistic. So he's just like, yeah, this God's awesome. And that God's awesome. And that God's awesome. But your God is awesome with the furnace. So it's a big deal at that point, but it had to continue. And from what I have gathered, from what I have seen, at least here in Western civilized America, is what creates a cultural rebellion. And some of the aspects of it that I've observed. So I have no science behind this. It's just things that I have seen. I'm not a history buff, but I like history because I like knowing why things are happening or where it came from. And when you look at the culture of rebellion, when you look at counterculture, it usually comes from some of these things. 1, marginalized people. Those who get marginalized and those who are oppressed by someone, they have to find a way to have their voice heard. We can think of the punk movement. We can think of the Black Panther movement. We can think of alternative rock movement, the grunge of the 90s. We can think of hip hop. It was a way for them to be able to express themselves because no one was listening to them. So a marginalized group is like a catalyst of a counterculture movement. Second, because they're marginalized, because it's the mainstream that is oppressing them, they very much become an anti-establishment movement. All those things, Black Panthers, hip-hop, punk rock, alternative rock. You can just think of any sort of counterculture thing that's taken over America. And usually this creates a movement because other people start finding out like, oh, there's other people who feel the way I feel. There's other people who are suffering the way I'm suffering. So then they begin to join this movement. And depending on the movement, because some of them grow, but then they kind of phase out, they kind of fizzle out. But other ones that get noticed, they get big enough and they get adopted. So depending on what the movement is and depending on how much it pushes on the social norms, the mainstream looks at the idea, looks at an opportunity, and adopts it into mainstream culture. And from there, that counterculture then evolves. Sometimes for the better, other times for the worse. But always for the profit. You better believe it. I don't want to say it. You heard it from Peter. I didn't say it. Really? Yes. Always for the profit. So what happened to punk style? Well, punk style was adopted by mainstream fashion, and now we get a diluted version of what punk is. We have punk influence in mainstream fashion. Now, punk rockers were not great musicians, at least some of them were not great musicians. They were standing against the inequality of the time. They had to be committed to what they were doing because they were not well liked. The podcast that we listened to, the guy who was doing the podcast, he remembered a time he was going to a bakery and a woman stopped him. And she was a Christian woman. She's like, I just want to ask you something. I'm just worried about you. What's your relationship with Satan? And he's like, what? And the people that are with him in the podcast like, what were you wearing? I was like, I was just wearing like a Husker Du t-shirt and some jeans and some Vans. And I was like, I wasn't even over the top, but I was considered punk. And I was like, oh, well, were you? He was like, no, I wasn't. I mean, I was punk, but not like the big time. He goes, but in my place, he lived in the Midwest. He goes, we were just called skaters and we were hated. Because they didn't really know what it was. And they were like, yeah, I would have rocks thrown at me. And they're like, really? You'd have rocks thrown at you? He's like, yeah. I was like, so why didn't you change? He's like, because I didn't want to be like everybody else. So I had to take the risk of getting rocks thrown at me. To be counterculture, you have to be committed to whatever that is in order for that movement to continue. So when it gets taken, are these cats punk rockers? My guess is probably not. I mean, maybe. But they're using the fashion to and I'm not saying it's not stylish, because I like some of these outfits. I'm not, don't hear what I'm not saying here. But it gets adopted and it turns into something different. Now, see, the thing is that God has called his people almost the entirety after Egypt to be counterculture. There's times you will hear over and over again in the Old Testament that God says in every land that they entered, do not follow the gods of their land. So although you're going there and you're going to be part of that, don't follow their gods. Why? Because of the first and second commandment. There's times where he asks, don't marry the people of that land. Don't have them as their wives, or don't interact, or don't give your kids up to them. And there's like over and over and over again, the constant theme is don't interact in these ways with the culture. Follow my commandments. And the thing about God's commandments is that they almost are very, very much counter to the culture. And then Jesus comes on the scene later. And the interesting thing about Jesus is that cat was a rebel too. He was a serious rebel. Now, we have sometimes in some of our cultures, we've made him kind of meek and mild, and he's always got a nice perm, and his clothes is always nice and washed and white. But I only know of one time that cat took a shower in Scripture. I'm sure there had been more than one, but there's only one recorded. But basically, Biscuits was homeless, and he was traveling around the land, and he was always causing trouble, I don't want to say not unintentionally, because there was sometimes he intentionally started a ruckus, but he was rebelling not only against the culture of the time, of the Roman culture, but even counterculture to the chosen people of Israel. There was times where even he was at odds with the religious leaders, not because God made a mistake of the people he chose, but because God was helping them understand his original message and evolving that message. And those who followed Jesus did things that were not popular to the time. And I like this verse in John. And this is Jesus talking to his disciples. Says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Now, why is this such a big deal? This sounds nice. This sounds like today, yeah, Christians, man, we're supposed to love everybody. God's all about love and love this and love that, which is true. But this statement at that time, we have to realize that at that time, today, what we would call them is they would be straight up racist back then. They did not mix with different races. They did not like the Samaritans. They did not like these people. There's time after time where they just simply don't like these people, groups of people. So for Jesus to start saying, look, because you're following me, love one another, because ultimately he moves that to the next level of now love your neighbor and love them as yourself. And so he starts off with this, like, you are to love one another like I have loved you. First, let's work on what's going on in here. Let's work on what's happening with us, because we got to get that right first. And then, once we got that right, we're going to move it out. This was a big deal for them, to love others. We say it today, we say it within our own culture, but we have more invisible lines at times in our culture. They had very clear-cut lines in their culture, and there's some things in here, and some things in our culture that are a little more clear-cut. So, as I read this, as I studied this, I felt convicted that my guess is that God is convicting some of us, God is calling some of us, and He's been calling some of us to be a little counterculture to what's going on around us. Here's just some of the things that I thought about in the counterculture that God has called us to. We're to love our neighbors. Well, yes, we're to love our neighbors. What does that mean? Well, that means love your neighbors regardless of their beliefs, their sexual orientation, their political view, their immigration status, whether they're from one place or another. Now, loving somebody doesn't mean you agree with everything they do, nor does it mean that you believe in everything they believe. My family loves me, and I'm pretty sure my wife loves me, but she does not agree with everything I say. And she does not agree with everything I do. And she doesn't believe everything I believe even. Man, that woman. But somehow she loves me. Somehow she puts up with me because she loves me. Same thing with my parents. Loving someone doesn't mean we accept and agree everything that they say or they do, but loving them means I accept you and I love you as a person. That is where we start. That is where we are. My parents, hopefully I'll never do anything where they're like, you know what? I'm not going to love you anymore. You're no longer our son. Hopefully that never happens. But I've made tons of mistakes. And I've made decisions that they are to this day still not happy with. But they still love me. This is what that commandment is saying. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. And when Christians get this right, amazing things have happened in the world. We're not to worship U.S. cultural idols. I don't want to get into what U.S. cultural idols are. My guess is some of you know what they are in your own life. But man, whatever idols have worked into your household, I would say start today and start getting rid of them. Turn back to God, whatever they are. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, my guess is they're not worth what God has in store for you. I don't know what they are, but I don't know how they're going to compare to the Creator of the world. Another thing, it says we're called to serve others, not ourselves. in our culture, are we a bit of a me culture? What's in it for me? What am I going to get out of this? How am I going to deal with this? Are we a little bit of me culture here? Just a little bit, right? Just a little bit. Yeah, one of the top principles, I've preached on this before, one of the top principles of the U.S. American culture is individualism. It is all about myself. Our point of view, my point of view, not others. And God calls us to be counterculture, to serve others, not ourselves. Even Jesus himself said, I came to serve others. We're called to be humble. There's one thing that I don't like. I like hip-hop music. I grew up with hip-hop music. I grew up with old school, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. I grew up with Curtis Blow, Run DMC, the Fat Boys, all of them. Old school. And they tend to talk about the social, what's going on within their communities. Hip-hop has moved into braggadocious, kind of over-the-top arrogance to it that I don't like. And also, I can't relate. I don't have a bunch of ladies. I know they use different words. I don't get a bunch of ladies and all my Benjamins. And, I drive a Honda Pilot because I have a family, so I'm not lowered. I don't got spinning rims. But there's this lack of humility in it that I don't appreciate. Now, I'm not saying that all hip-hop is that way, because there's some really good hip-hop that goes that way. But I don't think it's a healthy thing. The fellowship of believers, that's why we're here. You guys can come up. The fellowship of believers, one thing that God created us to be together. And the thing that we can do, the thing that we're doing here, us as a church, here on Saturday and other churches on Sundays or whatever it is that day, is that they're coming together with like-minded people to worship God. People come together in our culture to do different things. I don't necessarily know if they're worshiping things, but different things. And then last but not least, seek God's heart. And I think for myself, this is probably one of the biggest counterculture things that we're called to. And that is we're not seeking the popularity of the culture, popularity of our politics, the popularity even of our families, but to seek God's heart. And how do we do that? Through prayer, through reading His Scripture, through being together, through supporting one another, to point towards God. Even in the Bible, God called His people to do radical things. And I'm pretty sure He's calling all of us to do radical things here. So when I think of punk style, I think of their commitment to counterculture. And when I think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, and the Bible, and God, and Jesus, I think of the commitment to not listen to the culture, not that everything in the culture is bad, because there are some things that are good about it, but to be committed to go where God calls us. Bow your heads with me. Our Father in heaven, I want to thank you for today, Lord. I want to thank you for your word. I want to thank you for all that you're doing in our lives, Lord. I want to thank you for not giving up on us. Some of us who may have even given up on ourselves. Some of us who have heard whatever we heard from wherever, saying, you know what, I'm just not good enough. I'm not worthy. I can never be the right type of whatever it may be, God. But that is not your message. Your message is, I know that you fall short. I know you're a sinner. But that's why I sent my son to die on a cross to save you. Just come to me. Bring your burdens. Bring it to the cross. With that act alone, God, you showed us that we are worth every drop of blood shed by Christ. God, I ask that you continue in our lives, that you convict us of the things that may be pulling us down, and help us to turn back to you. Open the doors. Send your saints. Send a song. Send an article, a sermon, a friend, a Bible study, whatever it may be, God, so that we can turn back to you and wherever we're at. Because when we do, we may have to go through a fire, but it is in the fire that we get to meet you, God. Thank you for never giving up on us. And you're beautiful in your glorious name. And together we all said, Amen. Would you mind standing?